Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, I am pleased to welcome you to our virtual Holocaust survivor talk. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm an educator at the museum. For those of you who have not been to the museum before, ours is the first Holocaust survivor founded Holocaust museum in the United States, which you can see behind me in my virtual background. In the 1960s, a group of Holocaust survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became our museum. These survivors who established our museum did so with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we're still able to carry on this mission of theirs through our virtual programs. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Paul Kester, a Holocaust survivor from Germany, who will share his story with you. And during and afterwards, you can type in questions in the Q&A box, which I will then read to Paul after he speaks. And keep in mind, he might answer certain questions along the way, so you can hold your questions till the end, or feel free to ask them during as well. Without further ado, Paul, thank you so much for speaking with us this morning. We are so honored to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. It's always good to address an audience for the museum. I wish I could see everyone, but at least you can watch me and listen to what I'm going to tell you. You might ask, who am I? What am I? Well, I am a member of a tiny minority, a minority of Jewish children born in Europe after the First World War, who were still alive at the end of the Second World War. When we talk about the Holocaust, we talk about that the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews. Well, included in the 6 million were 1.5 million children. 1.5 million children who perished in the years 1941 to 1945. I was not one of them. I was lucky. So let me tell you my story. I was born in Germany, in West Germany, in a town called Wiesbaden, near Frankfurt, in the late 1925. Wiesbaden had a population of about 300,000 citizens, including a Jewish population of 3,000, or just 1%. This was somewhat similar to the composition or the percentage of Jews in Germany in 1933 before Hitler. Germany had about 600,000 Jews, a total population of 65 million, again, just barely 1%. Now, when I was a child, I remember the late 20s and early 30s. I remember the political propaganda that went on, the signs and the flags all over town by the different parties. And I also remember that there were difficult times. My family had a clothing store. We were middle class, and I had one sister and myself. The two of us were not impacted by the economic hardships that went on during that time. The family kept us going there was no shortage of food or clothing. But I remember the beggars that would come to the door in the morning and ask for some pennies or some bread. And I also remember the signs for lease, empty apartments. So I had some impact I felt from the bad, poor depression years that went on at that time. I started school at the age of 6 in 1932. And shortly thereafter, the Nazis had become the largest party in Germany, and Hitler became chancellor in late January of 1933. Now, the Nazi party, as one of its goals and objectives, was to eliminate or at least curtail whatever influence or economic resources the Jewish population had. The Nazi propaganda, I remember, as I said, I was 70 years old. I could read enough to see that the big, large signs all over town spelled out that the Jews are a misfortune, the Jews are criminals, the Jews cheat and steal, and they are the guilty ones that we lost the First World War. Now, it was difficult for me to comprehend, because I knew that my parents, my grandparents, and relatives and friends of the family, that they were not criminals. So how could they put up all these signs and claim that's what we were? Well, as I said before, the change in circumstances, the beginning hardship and against the Jews in Germany, we as children did not feel it that much. In school, public school, I was, which I went on between the age of 6 to 10. Those 4 years, I was the only boy in a class of 30, 35 boys. Schools in those days were kept separate for boys and girls. I was one of the other kids. I guess the only difference that I felt was when it was talk about religion, the other kids or their families, if they were religious, would go to church. And if you were Jewish, you went to a synagogue. My family and the other Jewish members of family and friends were pretty much assimilated. My family traced its back. I have a family tree going back to the 15th century, all in West Germany. And especially during the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, the Jews in Germany became pretty much assimilated and were not subject to any restrictions. We were part of society and didn't feel much different from the rest of the population. Now, with Hitler and his anti-Jewish and pro-Aryan ideology, this changed. And of course, it must have had a severe impact on the adults. But as I said before, as children, we were not that much affected by it. Some people, some Jewish friends or relatives left Germany, but for us, a family of 4 with grandparents, and it was a going business, it was difficult to even think about having to leave Germany, our home country, and emigrate to another country where you were not wanted or needed, where you didn't speak the language, and where you couldn't practice your profession or your business. And also you couldn't take any, especially after the 1936, you couldn't take anything along other than personal belongings. No money, no items of value. So how could you decide to just pack up and go? In 1936, I started high school. Wiesbaden had 3 high schools for boys, and there were certain scholastic requirements which I easily met. And but the first school where my father tried to enroll me, the principal told him that the school was 100% Nazi and that he could not make sure that to protect the safety of his son. So that was effectively a no. The second school also had some excuse. The third one accepted me and also my close friend, Jewish friend Leo. So we started the high school where the education was more and more geared towards the Nazi curriculum. But even though we were socially not part of it, because the other boys belonged to the Hitler Youth, and after school, that's where they did their activities. Leo and I were members of the Jewish sports club, and our social life was among other Jewish kids in town. But teachers were fair and there was no outright discrimination. And the other boys, maybe once in a while, would say something about referring to us being Jewish, but there was no open hostility or the other boys being aggressive against us. Everybody was concerned about his performance in school. The demands were high. At the age of 10, we had started with Latin, and we had all the other subjects. The scholastic, we had to be, was always a lot of homework, but I was a good student, so I managed to keep my own. Also, sport now was becoming very much a subject of importance. This was following the idea that kids have to be physically and not only intellectually well brought up, but as new German Aryan race, they also had to perform well in sports. Again, my friend Leo and I managed to meet all requirements in all these areas, and we were not different from the other kids. I remember one lecture where the teacher explained the difference between the Aryan race and other races. And they had big pictures put up on the wall. On one side, they're showing ugly Jews, big ears, stomachs, ugly features. And on the other wall, the Aryan ideal, tall, blonde, straight noses, blue eyes. But Wiesbaden was not part of northern Germany or Scandinavia. The kids in class did not meet the looks of the pictures of the Aryans on one wall. I, at that time, had blonde hair, blue eyes, straight nose. I was more looking like the Aryan ideal, and certainly not like the ugly Jews on the other wall. Now, after the teacher had explained the difference between the two races, the inferior Jews and the superior Aryans, he said, we do have two Jewish boys in the class, and they don't look like, and he pointed to the wall with the ugly Jewish pictures. But keep in mind, boys, this is a lesson in theory. And he also mentioned that there was no excuse to be nasty to us, two Jewish boys, because of what had been taught in class. Life went on, and immigration became more of an issue. In some younger people, family left, and it so happened that we had a relative in New York, brother of my grandmother, and we had asked if he could provide affidavits, which were needed, financial guarantees, to immigrate to the United States. Well, they didn't do it for the family, but they said, we take one of the children. Well, my sister being the older one, in the summer of 1938, 14 years old, my mother took her to Hamburg, and she sailed from there. In those days, one traveled by boat to New York. I was somewhat jealous. I also wanted to leave Germany, but nothing happened. But anyhow, the summer of 1938, I still had a nice vacation visiting my relatives on the countryside, and came back, and school started again with its requirements and the afternoon activities. We were at the Jewish Sports Club. We still could go to public places like movies or parks. And we children still led a relatively normal life. But then one day in November of 1938, Leo, my friend Leo, and I were in class. An school administrator came in and said, you two boys better go home. There is trouble in town. We went home, and I found my mother and grandmother, who lived with us, rather upset. When they had tried to go to the store where both of them worked, my father had left earlier, they had to pass by on their way the synagogue, which was in the center of the town, and it was in flames. It was being burned down. And also all Jewish stores that still existed were being vandalized and smashed. So they went back home. My father, who had been earlier to the store to open it up, found a large crowd in front of it. The store had many display windows, a lot of glass fixtures, and all of that was being smashed to pieces by a large crowd of people who had assembled in front of the store. Two policemen asked my dad to come with them, but finding their way through the crowds, it became kind of push and shove, and my father managed to disappear sideways and managed to get away from the police, and was hiding in the mountains surrounding Wiesbaden for the next couple of days. because all men between the ages of 16 and 60 that day were being arrested and sent to concentration camps. This supposedly was to punish the Jewish population for a murder of a German official at the French embassy in Paris by a Jewish young man. Leo and I went back to school the next day and were called to the principal's office, where he informed us that we no longer were allowed to attend a German school. Well, at 12 or almost 13 years old, a forced vacation is not such a severe penalty, but the overall atmosphere, the smashing of stores, the burning of synagogue, the arrests of all males had its impact. A couple of days later, I think it was November 12th or 13th, my father came back because it seemed that the arrests of the men had stopped. Well, in the evening, the doorbell rings. We lived in an apartment. A man in civilian clothes identifies himself as a member of the secret police, the Gestapo, and demands that my father comes with him. So within a couple of minutes, he is gone. We don't know where to. My mother sends me on a bike. This was a November night, to some friends to warn them that the arrests were still going on. The following weeks were traumatic. The first thing my mother and I had to do was to clean up the store. I remember 2 weeks we worked, and I gathered up broken glass for that period of time, all day long. And I remember I couldn't sleep at night because the noise of broken glass was still in my ears. And where's my father? Where are the men? Well, the news started coming in. A cousin of mine in his early 20s supposedly had died of a heart attack at the concentration camp of Buchenwald. And other members of the family got similar notifications that people had died in these 3 concentration camps that where the Jews had been sent in those days. Somehow we found out that my father had been sent to Dachau, the infamous concentration camp that had existed right after the Nazis, that had been come into existence shortly after the Nazis came to power, and that created more notoriety after American troops liberated it in April of 1945, when Germany was finally occupied and defeated at the end of World War II. After a couple of weeks, my mother somehow had found out that some men were coming back from the concentration camp and sent me to the Central Railroad Station to see if my father was among them. I saw the men coming down. These were men in their 40s or 50s, members of the community, lawyers, doctors, business people. But they now appeared as they stepped off the train in terrible condition, emaciated, dirty, a view that has been with me for ever since. And my father was not among them. Everybody realized that the pogrom of November 1938, later identified and labeled as Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, the night of the broken glass, of which my family had gotten its ample share, that this was really the beginning of the end for Jews in Europe. But where to go? No country wanted you. The Germans would let you out as long as you wouldn't take anything of value along. But no country was willing to accept Jews. But we found out all of a sudden that some countries were willing to take children. England said they take 10,000. France, Belgium, and Holland took some. And my mother put me on every list to get me out. My friend Leo, in early December, just 1 month after the pogrom had started, left Wiesbaden. I bid him goodbye. He took the train to Amsterdam, Holland, where he had relatives. I wished I could have gone with him. Little did I know what his fate ultimately would be. A few years later, his final address was concentration camp Birkenau near Auschwitz. A few days later, we get a letter from a distant relative from Sweden, a teacher at a German refugee school for the German Jewish children, that was going to accept 40 children out of the 500 that Sweden was willing to take. Sweden's Jewish community was very small. Only 6,000 Jews lived in Sweden at the time. And they had to guarantee our support and assume financial responsibility. So they said they could take 500. This school got allocated 40 of the 500, and I was one of them. Within 2 days, I get a letter from the Swedish embassy in Berlin, the German capital, that they had a visa for me. So now I get removed from any other list, and obviously Sweden is my destination. A couple of days later, my father comes back from Dachau. I was not at home when he arrived. By the time I meet him a few hours later, he's cleaned up and looks his normal self. He always was in good physical condition and managed to survive the hardship that the man had to undergo during his 4 weeks at Dachau. How do I get to Sweden? I know to England they had organized train rides, but there was apparently no organization to get me to Sweden. My father found out that there was a near Wiesbaden in one of the large chemical industries. One of the executives was an honorary consul for Sweden. We got an audience with him. My father wanted to know what I would have to do to get to Sweden. The man gave good advice. He says, put your son on a train, get him out as quickly as possible. Well, my father and I still traveled to Westphalia to see the family, other close relatives who lived there, to bid them goodbye. I remember Christmas Eve, we were there, and my father's family, he had 4 brothers. All they could talk about was the experiences they had in different camps, 2 in Buchenwald, 1 in Sachsenhausen. But they had survived. But now the question was, where can we go? What can we do? All the businesses were confiscated or put out of business. It was where I used to spend all my vacation with these relatives. It used to be my summer paradise. Now it was a dismal place where I felt that my life had come to an end as I had known it up to that moment. Back to Wiesbaden, a few more days of getting things packed. My personal belongings were packed in the presence of a police official to make sure that I was only allowed to take personal clothing and personal objects, nothing of value, no money. These things were then sent on to Sweden. On the 9th of January, I bid goodbye to my grandmother. My parents go with me to the central station. My mother bids me goodbye, hopes to see me soon again. My father goes with me from Wiesbaden on the train to Frankfurt, from where I take the non-stop train to Berlin. Again, goodbye, and a hopeful wish for Auf Wiedersehen. I was pretty independent at the early age of 13. A train ride by myself was no new experience. I get to Berlin. I stay with a cousin and his wife. He takes me to the Swedish embassy. I get my papers, my visa, and a few days later, January 15th, I remember it was a Sunday, I take the train from Berlin through northern Germany to Sweden. To get to Sweden, you had to cross the Baltic Sea. The Baltic was the borderline between Germany and Sweden. On the train ride through northern Germany, the last thing happens is an official, again in black uniform, Gestapo, checks my little luggage, what I had with me. Most of it had been sent ahead. I had gotten a last minute present, a book. He said, no books allowed. Takes it, I couldn't care less as long as I get out. Now, normally people leaving Germany, Jews leaving Germany at that time, were allowed to take along 10 mark, which I guess equivalent at that time of $5. But there was a question in our minds if I, a child, was entitled to take this large sum along. And my cousin, who had taken me to the train station, said, "Why don't you spend it so to avoid the issue?" So I go to the dining car, have a meal, and for the rest of the money buy some chocolate. And I'm left now with a total sum of St. Pfennig. I guess you might call it a nickel or a dime. Traveling by myself to a foreign country where I don't speak the language. But all this didn't bother me. All I wanted was to get out. Ultimately, the train arrives at the border town in northern Germany. The train goes on a ferry. The ferry starts moving. I look out. It's a dismal, kind of foggy January afternoon. And as the ferry moves, I slowly see the German shoreline disappearing on the horizon. I had a sense of tremendous relief. The last 2 months had been a severe traumatic experience. And now I could leave this behind me. And I was fully aware that this was a major event in my life, and that I was relieved that I had left a country where now it was a crime to be Jewish. I get to Sweden. I was being met in the little town in southern part of Sweden. They take my car. We go to the boarding school, Jewish boarding school, where I spend the next year and a half. It was a good experience for me. The kids I met there became family, not only during the short few years I was there, but for the rest of my life. I stay in contact with my parents, my family, by mail. In those days, one didn't use phones, one wrote letters. And this continued until September of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II had started. And now the mail still continued, but it was censored by the Germans to make sure that nothing was written by either me or by my family that was not to their liking. This mail contract continues by September, but in 1942, I realize that my family no longer can stay in Wiesbaden, that deportations have started. And my parents write to me about it, indicating that they may be sent to Theresienstadt, a ghetto town in what is now the Czech Republic. They indicate that it might be difficult to stay in touch with me, but I sent right away cards with return receipts, registered mail to each member of the family, my father, my mother, my grandmother, to Theresienstadt. And within days, I get their signatures where they can write down their correct address in Theresienstadt. The Germans were quite precise when it came to observe international postal regulations between Nazi Germany and a neutral country, which Sweden was. In 1940, I come to another children's home and I start attending the Swedish high school until the age of 16. I then moved to Stockholm, where I start working, and I go to night school. And I stay in contact with my parents in Theresienstadt for a few months. Then my mail comes back with a stamp that they had left Theresienstadt, which I knew that that was bad news. They were shipped east. I didn't know where. I found out later that the destination was Auschwitz, where upon their arrival, they were murdered. My grandmother stayed on in Theresienstadt for another year. I could send her mail and also some small packages. But in May of 1944, she passed away. She died there, which was a blessing because she was scheduled a few days later for also for transport to Auschwitz. We follow the war years. Finally comes to an end in 1945. Nobody is alive anymore of the family. In 1946, I go on a visit trip to the United States. I get reunited with relatives, including my sister. I travel by Greyhound bus all the way to Los Angeles. I like California, I like Los Angeles, but I felt my home was Sweden, and I came back after a few months in the United States. 1947, my first trip to the continent, Holland, Belgium, and to Germany. An uncle had survived, I visit him. But I see the devastation and the hardship of Western Europe. I see the encroachment by the Soviet Union taking over many countries, all of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And in 1948, I decided to try my luck and actually emigrate to the United States. I come to Los Angeles, back to Los Angeles in early 1949. I have lived here for the last 70 years. My wife, who also was a kid at that refugee school that I mentioned earlier, my wife and I are lucky here. We have a son. We enjoyed to build up a new existence. Again, I go to night school. I become a CPA. And I can look back now on many, many happy years. I'm proud to be a citizen of this country. And I must say I've been lucky. Lucky that my parents were willing to let their kids leave, not knowing if they would ever see them again. Lucky that I got to a neutral country that was not occupied in Europe, that was not occupied by the Nazis. Lucky that Hitler lost the war. It assured my survival. Lucky that I had good genes and was able to create for myself and my family again a happy and satisfying life. And I would like to find out if there are any questions in the remaining time.
Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your story with us this morning. We do have a few questions from some members of our audience. First, one of our viewers would like to know, when do you think the real difficulties began? Was it after the Reichstag fire and the last elections on March of 33?
Well, the first demonstration against Jewish stores was April 1933, April 1st, but it was not very successful. Germans still went to their Jewish stores and did their shopping there. So the people who were impacted immediately were employees of government employees and professors at universities, students at universities. But the rest of us had still a relatively normal existence until after the Olympics, which were in 1936. In 1937-38, it became more restrictive. Yes, we had decided to close my family had decided that they couldn't keep the store going any longer and had planned to close it in late 1938 or early 39. Well, the Nazis managed to come before to smash it and destroy it. The Kristallnacht was really the deciding event that from then on that there was no life, no existence anymore for Jews in Germany. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Do you know what happened to your friend Leo?
Yes, he was in Holland. He was in early 1942. He had an older sister who couldn't get out, who was doing slave labor in Berlin. I was in contact with her. She asked me, could I, that Leo had left Amsterdam. She couldn't establish any contact with him. Maybe I could. His address was concentration camp Birkenau near Auschwitz. I wrote again a card, return receipt, registered mail, and again the observance of postal regulations functioned beautifully. The card came back with a stamp, concentration camp refuses acceptance of mail. And later on, I learned that Leo had been sent to Auschwitz in the spring of 1942. And there was actually, at that time, the Nazis still kept records that he had died at Auschwitz 3 months later. I often think of his fate, and I can't imagine what those 3 months must have been like. He and so many other kids that I grew up with who couldn't get out and were sent east to a certain death. It's them, they being part of the 1.5 million. I think of them often now. And try to explain the unexplainable. I've spoken here quite often, but also in Germany, to students as recently as last year. And some of the German students a couple of times asked me, this is in recent years, are we guilty? And I tell them, you're not guilty what happened during the lifetime of your grandparents or great-grandparents. But you have a historical obligation to know the history of your country. And you have the obligation to make sure that the present freedom that you enjoy and democracy, that you preserve it, that you don't hate, and that you continue to be tolerant towards your neighbor and towards all human beings. And that's a message basically that I also try to convey when I talk to students here. Don't hate, be tolerant, preserve the freedoms that's given to you. It must be defended. I have seen it being destroyed. Don't let it happen to you and the country wherever you live. Any other questions?
Thank you, Paul. When you left Sweden for the United States, did you keep in touch with anybody, any of the children who you knew in Sweden?
Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, we traveled quite often to Europe, including Sweden, and visited families that we had met as kids, not only in Sweden, but in England and Israel. And it was satisfying to see that these kids who had shared same experiences that my wife and I had, that they all had become normal citizens, formed normal families, and were able to build up new lives. Having their memories, but looking forward. When you are young, it's easier to do.
Thank you very much. Can you tell the audience what happened to your sister, and what was your relationship with her like after the war? And did any of your extended family members, aunts, uncles, or cousins survive?
My sister, she was 14, I was 12 when we were separated, when she left for the United States. I met her again in 1946, some 8 years later. We were, at this time, we had grown up under quite different circumstances, different surroundings, but we shared the memories from our childhood, and we had close family ties. Her two children, the son lives here in Los Angeles, the daughter in Sacramento. We are very close. Other relatives who survived some. There was one uncle in Germany. He was married to a Catholic lady and was not deported until spring of 1945, 3 months before the end of the war. The SS and the Gestapo still had time to do it when the rest of Germany was falling apart, being bombed to pieces. Still had time to send him to Theresienstadt. But he survived and his family survived. And I visited him in 1947 and years thereafter. And I had the pleasure with my son and my granddaughters and my daughter-in-law to be in Germany last year to attend my German first cousin's granddaughter's wedding. So there's close ties with those who managed to survive in Germany, in the United States, and in Israel. We treasured those ties with them over the years. And still today, those who are still around, and the younger generation certainly are close to me and to my family, and we are lucky to have them.
Thank you, Paul. And can you please talk a little bit about your career in the United States and about what your family does now?
When I came here in 1949, I got a job at the LA Transit Lines bus and streetcar company. I had no professional training. I had to keep certain records. And I wanted to find out more about it. So I took a night school class in bookkeeping at Belmont Evening High School. And upon the teacher's recommendation, since I wanted to find out more about it, sent me to the UCLA extension, where I was interviewed by the dean and said, "What brings you here?" And I said, "I want to find out more about bookkeeping." And he said, "You want to become a CPA?" And I said, "A what?" To make a long story short, 2 years later, I passed the exam. I went to work for one of the largest and big 8 accounting firms for a couple of years. And in 1954, I became the 3rd employee of a former teacher of mine at UCLA Extension, who had started his own practice. We were 3 or 4 hardworking Jewish kids. We managed to somehow build up an expertise in assisting and helping the then rapidly growing real estate industry in Southern California with their taxes, their finances. The firm grew rapidly by the time I retired as a partner in 1989, some 35 years later. The small firm of 3 or 4 from 1954 now was a small national firm of 1,500 accountants in 10 different offices across the United States. Subsequent to my retirement, the next generation merged with Ernst & Young, one of the remaining Big Four. We worked hard, we were smart, we were successful and able to grow with the ongoing growth that in Southern California and beyond. My wife stayed home after she was professionally from Sweden, interior decorator, when my son was born, but then became active once he started school and she had more time, and was during 35 or 40 years a volunteer worker, what is now the Skirball Cultural Center. And but we were active in many other organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish. We were supportive of the Skirball Center, the Los Angeles Philharmonic. We were ardent music lovers. We are supporting the Venice Family Clinic and many other institutions. We are happy to be able to be active in the community and be of help. I always say I was a recipient in my early Swedish years of charity. I accepted it, I had no choice. But I'm glad that in later years, I was able to share with others some of the success that I experienced here. My wife passed away 3 years ago. I'm now in a retirement home. I'm well taken care of. And I keep close contact with the relatives, family that are still around.
Thank you very much, Paul. At the time you went to Sweden in January of 1939, Germany was still allowing Jews to migrate to Israel or Palestine then under the Havara program. Did you or your family in Germany ever consider that, as it would have allowed you to keep more of your assets, although it would have been subject to restrictions? This was a question from one.
Two of my cousins, first cousins, who were in their early 20s in 1933 and 1934, left to what then was Palestine and still could take some money along and reestablish themselves in Palestine and later Israel. After 1935 or 36, if you could get a certificate to get to then Palestine, you could leave, but by that time, the restrictions on what you could take to a foreign country were severe, as I had mentioned earlier. And quite a few of the kids that I met in Sweden, the Jewish school, went on Aliyah to originally Palestine, still in 1939 and 1940, and then later after 1945. It was, since my sister could get to the United States, my and other relatives, my objective, my intention was, if I would leave Sweden, it would be the United States and not Israel, for family reasons. And also, I knew that life in Palestine, Israel was very difficult in those early years. And I thought that it might be, while I was supportive of the creation and of Israel and support it still today, it was more I was more interested to come here and make my life here.
Thank you, Paul. Do you know how your father got out of Dachau?
He was a veteran of World War I, which counted. And also, if you declared your intention of leaving Germany, they would let you go. The arrest of 30 or 40,000 men and sent to the camps at Kristallnacht or the days after, most of them were released within weeks or months. Very few, if they survived, very few were left behind by the time the war broke out, unless there was some special reason. But the people that I knew, both family and friends with the men, had been sent to the camps in November of 38. After several weeks, came back home, at least those who survived the hardship during that relatively short period. If Jews, and for that matter, non-Jews, were convicted of crimes, be they actual or contrived by the Nazis, if they were condemned to spend a certain number of years or in the camp, I mean, those, of course, did not come back. But they were the minority.
Thank you, Paul. So just as a last question, where did you live when you were at the school in Sweden, and did you have contact with the Jewish organization that sponsored you?
But I lived the first 3.5 years in these homes established or supported by the Jewish community. And when I came to Stockholm in 1942, I was employed as sort of office clerk by the Jewish community and worked for them for the next 3 or 4 years. First in their regular administration, and after 1945, helping the thousands of concentration camp survivors that were taken in by Sweden for rehabilitation and recovery, to help them to establish normal lives again, to establish contact with any relatives they may have had. I, at that time, was pretty fluent in English and French and, of course, German and Swedish. So I handled a lot of correspondence and looking back, I'm glad I could help these survivors who were in camps to first and then slowly absorbed in the Swedish community. I was even teaching them Swedish, some of them, and of course I was supported, or you might say, my existence in the early 3 years was Jewish community did that. Later on, they also helped I think Sweden took in 40 or 50,000 survivors in spring of 1945, mostly women. And I'm glad I could help them to somehow find a way back to normality. Those were interesting years, devastating in their magnitude by the eradication of Jews in Europe, plus millions who otherwise non-Jews killed at the front or in the cities. It's hard to put myself back in the circumstances or the conditions that I observed and experienced in my early youth.
Thank you so much, Paul.
One more comment.
Of course.
We all are somewhat quite a bit impacted by the virus situation in this country. But I have to remind myself what little hardship I suffer from it, face in comparison, cannot be compared to the tragedies and destruction that took place in Europe in the early 1940s.
Thank you so much again, Paul. We are so honored and so grateful to have you as part of our community and to share your family's story with us. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everyone that while the museum is currently closed, we regularly provide virtual programs like this one. You can always find our event schedule on our website or on our Facebook page. Tomorrow, we are hosting a program with the Giffords Law Center, a conversation about the intersection between guns and hate. We'll look at statistics and trend in the number of hate crimes and the groups being targeted, with a focus on how the COVID-19 pandemic is fueling both hate incidents and gun purchases. And this will be, again, with our museum, Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, and the Giffords Law Center. Next Tuesday at 11 a.m., we have Gerda Seifer, a Holocaust survivor from Poland, who will be sharing her story with us. Thank you, everybody who listened and who asked questions. And again, thank you so much, Paul, for speaking this morning and for sharing your story. And we're all so thankful for that opportunity. And I just want to let you know, you had viewers from all over the US this morning, including North Carolina, Ohio, and all over California, and in Germany as well. So thank you so much for what you've done.
I'm sorry I can't see you, but I hope what I said was of interest. Thank you for listening.